Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint grass in acrylics. Now the first thing that I'm actually doing here with a filbert brush is I applied some water to the surface first. Then what I'm doing now is using a small round brush to apply a mid-tone of green and then softening it out with a makeup brush. Now this is going to be my three main processes throughout this, but I'm going to be building up my layers gradually. Now this is something that I talk about in all of my tutorials here on YouTube and on Patreon. So again, you saw there that I added the water. Now I'm going to add some of the grass, the brush strokes, and then I will come back in with my makeup brush and soften the edges. Now when we want to build up with the layers, the values when we work with painting realistic grass is really important. Now this is obviously the same when painting fur, but for grass I recommend to have at least 3 values. So you want to have a darker green, a mid-tone green and a highlight green. Now this is going to really make it easier to build up depth and also more of that natural variation in the grass. Now the other thing to bear in mind is when painting grass, the grass is going to vary depending on what type of grass it is. So whether or not it's shorter grass as well compared to longer grass, we're going to be having to use different brushes accordingly depending on that. But for something like this, with this guinea pig, it was just sat more on shorter grass like you would typically get if your garden had just been mowed. So that was the sort of texture that I was trying to create here. Now in order to replicate that, I have had to keep my brush strokes nice and short. Now I have a video here on YouTube, it's my top tips for painting realistic fur in acrylics. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. Now although that video does relate to painting fur, it would be the same when painting grass. Now those 3 main things that I talk about are the length of the brush strokes, the thickness of the brush strokes and the way that the brush strokes are directed. So as you can see here, I've got a variation with the length. They're not all the same length and they're not all curving in the same direction. This is going to help to build up that natural variation. Now the thickness of the brush strokes is obviously going to depend on, again, the grass texture, but we want to be making sure that we've got the right amount of paint loaded on our brush, that we're using the right amount of pressure on the brush, and how we're holding the brush is correct. Now those 3 factors are going to affect the thickness, the direction, everything that we do when we create those brush strokes. And then that is replicated throughout the layering process. Now the layers is something that I talk about thoroughly in all of my tutorials because this is what's going to help to build up depth. Now alongside that, the contrast is also really important. I've mentioned at the beginning of this video that I recommend to have at least 3 values of green. That's going to help to build up more of that depth. But ideally, I like to work with at least 5 if I can, because I feel that gives me a really nice balance, aids the depth and the realism. Now as I build up here, look at how the contrast is starting to be reinforced. But with this painting, because I've already got a dark green background, that base layer is already providing me with that initial value. So I've already got some of that darker green showing through the individual blades of grass that I'm now painting. Now if you're working on a painting where the background is a different colour, so you don't have a green base, I would recommend to paint a base foundation in of a mixture of your darker greens and your midtones. I wouldn't recommend to just block it in with one solid value. I would still hint at your main lights and darks exactly as I would if I was painting fur, and that's going to help to build up more of a soft layer early on. Now I've got lots of videos here on YouTube that show how I paint my base layers when I'm working with fur. Any of those techniques that I'm showing there can be applied for the base layer of the grass. Now one thing I want to mention when painting grass, this relates to the animal and the fur. With this guinea pig, the fur was quite long, so the shorter grass was actually in some cases underneath some of the sections of fur. So you'll notice that the fur on the lower part of the body, it looks unfinished, and that's deliberate. I had to paint the grass first because, as I've said, that's underneath some of the sections of fur, and then I had to come back at the end of the painting and add the fur over the top. Now I don't want to do that in all cases because if you've got longer blades of grass, that grass is going to be in front of that animal. And there are of course a few little bits that I'm going to be adding at the end to make some of those bits of grass appear on top. But we do want to be studying that reference photo and making sure that we are assessing whether or not the fur needs to be painted first or last. Now the techniques that I'm showing here can be applied when painting any other foliage, so bushes or trees. You would use the same concept in terms of at least 3 shades of green, and I recently uploaded a seascape painting here to YouTube where I've got some of the palm trees, there's some bushes and so on that I've included there, so I'll link that video in the description below if it's of interest. But you'll see that although I'm using a different selection of brushes, I'm still building up my layers in a similar way. I want to be focusing on the values. Now with any of my portraits, that's the key for me. You'll see here that I'm really not focusing on the right shade of green, the colour and so on. That I can add with glazes. But I just want to be focusing on my main lights and darks. However, like when we paint fur, I haven't jumped into using my lightest mixture first. If I do that, I'm missing out on all of that layer of depth underneath. So I want to be focusing on those all important midtones. Now midtones is something that I focus all of my tutorials on, both here on YouTube and my step-by-step real-time tutorials on Patreon. Now by focusing on the mid-tone layers as well, this enables us to capture that effect that it makes it look like we've painted thousands of individual blades of grass, which of course we haven't here. We've painted a lot, but it's not that extreme. By focusing on the midtones, making sure that there is enough of those in place, when we come back in with our highlights, it's going to make a huge difference. Now as you can see here, as I'm starting to build up the next layer, I'm focusing on more smaller sections. Now if you've seen my other videos here on YouTube, you'll know that when I paint fur, I only really work on 1 or 2 square inches at one time. And I'm sort of now working with the same method. I'm breaking each section up into manageable chunks, but I work my way across from left to right. I'm not just trying to block each layer in solid, because I feel then I'm going to end up cutting corners, and of course that's something that I really want to be aware of. It would be a real shame if the grass was not as realistic as the animal that we're painting, because that would potentially bring down the whole piece altogether. So I want to be making sure that I am still giving each layer the right amount of time and breaking it up in a way that does mean I'm not going to rush. Now as I start to work with another layer here, you can see that it gets a little bit lighter. I'm just building up a little bit more of that variation, again working in small sections to make sure that I'm not blocking anything in too quickly. This is also where I'm starting to overlap some of the blades of grass onto the lower part of the guinea pig's body. This is going to help for me to then create that natural edge when I come back in with my fur details, that I don't have a solid blocked in section where the grass starts and the fur starts. So this here is just something that I want to be really paying attention to. I always talk about the importance of building up that softness by working on the right layer at the right time. And if I did notice any sections of fur that almost were sort of in between the layers of grass, then I'd have to add those sections of fur in at this point now, in with my midtones. So then if there was any longer blades of grass that were overlapping, I would be able to add those in at the end. So always look at that reference photo and try to work out what is in front of something first, which I know I've already mentioned in this video, but it is really important when painting grass. Now a great example of that would be, let's say we are painting a lion and we've got all of that long grass in the savannah. That is going to be overlapping potentially right up to the elbows. Sometimes you might not even see hardly any of the legs visible. It's going to depend on the length of the grass, and because it can vary so much, it's something where the techniques would be the same, but you're going to really have to adjust the length of your brush strokes as you layer. Now also, when you're working on painting grass that's in front of an animal, let's say for instance the foot of the guinea pig, a lot of the claws are going to get covered up. Most of the toe sections on the lower side are going to get covered up as well. But I wanted to make sure that I painted something in so that it would, like sections would show through individual blades of grass. Rather than me just leaving it blank, I'd end up with more of a harsher edge where the foot was and the grass began. I've deliberately brought some of the toes in place. I know I'm going to have to paint over them, so therefore painting the toes might seem like a little bit of a pointless process. But with this, because I'm not trying to make every single blade of grass in the right place according to the reference photo, that's not something I feel I need to do. I wanted to make sure that I had that foot visible so that I could overlap the blades of grass where I wanted, moving my hand more freely, more of a natural way. I didn't want that pressure of making sure that I also had to cover up every single part of that foot in relation to the photograph I'm working from. So here, for example, as I've said, if you can't see all of that section of the toe, I would hint at something there, just in case, even if it is just a darker value that's not green. It gives you something then to overlap your brush strokes on top of. Now the very last thing that I do here is once all of the grass is dry, I come back in and use a glaze to hint at a shadow underneath the guinea pig. This is going to help to really soften this edge because of course following the light source I want that guinea pig to look like it's part of that scenery. So therefore the fact that it would be resting on the grass, there would be this shadow. And all I'm doing here is using a glaze to do this, and as you can see all of those blades of grass are still visible. Now I've got a video here on YouTube that focuses all on glazing, so if you are interested in watching that, because I use it throughout all of my paintings to adjust the colour, the values and so on, then I'll link that video in the description below. I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be really grateful. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in painting along to this guinea pig or any of my other real-time step-by-step tutorials, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.